Well, hello! This is the second part to a much longer reaction. If you haven't seen them yet, links to them are in the description as well in the top corner of the video. Now, with that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
In terms of motive, Caddy is a practitioner of the occult who blatantly dislikes how cheerful and enthusiastic her family is, as she literally says that she wishes they were more goth. So, to be certain, she definitely seems to have the right disposition to want to bring about an era of darkness. And perhaps most importantly, her research into the occult gives a viable way for her to have discovered the existence of dark worlds and how to create them. This is actually pretty rare, as most of the other candidates, even if they have the right disposition, don't have a clear route for discovering the existence of the roaring or the dark fountains in the first place. So Caddy definitely has the edge in that regard. That said, beyond her goth nature, I do find it dubious that she would actually end up wanting the roaring to happen, especially since it feels like she's probably going to have an adventure with Chris, much like Berdly and Noelle in one of the future chapters. Although that is admittedly just speculation on my part. In terms of opportunity, she is a student at the school and thus has the opportunity to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. However, much like Burger Pants, Caddy has a job that she works in the afternoon, so it's possible that she has too strong of an alibi to successfully create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. Overall, Caddy is an occult practitioner with the right hobbies and interests to conceivably be the Roaring Knight, and she matches a couple of the Knight's attributes. But she has nothing to do with armor or weapons, and her afternoon job puts her in the wrong place to actually be in position to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. As such, I'd say she's a solid B tier. Next up is Caddy's older sister, Caddy. Caddy has all the same problems as Bratty, but is arguably even more unlikely to be the knight. She has paws instead of hands, she has nothing to do with the knights or armor or weapons, and it's debatable if she has any meaningful amount of determination. She might have somewhat long arms and the correct number of fingers, but that's the only aspect of her appearance that even remotely matches the knight. In terms of motive, much like Bratty, I really have no idea. It really doesn't make sense, as Caddy is arguably even more happy with her lot in life than Bratty was, and thus it seems unlikely that she would want to bring about an era of darkness, and that's assuming she even has the ability to bring something like that about, which is highly dubious, as she's not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. And unlike Bratty, Caddy actually has a family member attending the school, so her creating a dangerous dark world in the school makes even less sense. As for opportunity, she could theoretically sneak her way into the school or the library, but again, it is highly debatable if Caddy is competent enough to pull off such a scheme. There's no proof that she couldn't have made these dark fountains, but the entire concept does feel out of character for her. The only tiny detail that might hint at Caddy being responsible for creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is the fact that she has a room in the Queen's mansion. This implies that she has, in fact, visited the library before, and thus could have been at the scene of the crime. But that's literally the only suspicious detail about her entire character.
I mean, I always assumed the people with rooms in Queen's Mansion was very much a thing around, like, oh, who had used the computer before and who had a search history. So, yeah.
So that hardly amounts to much. Overall, Caddy is just like her former best friend, Bratty, as she is not very knight-like, has no clear motivation for wanting to bring the roaring about, and she is a joke character that Toby Fox would never make the primary antagonist in a million years. Honestly, I think it makes even less sense for Caddy to be the knight than Bratty, so I'm putting her at the very bottom of D tier. Next is the original adopted child of the Dreamer family, Chara. This one is rather interesting, as it is assuming that there is a Chara in the Deltarune timeline.
Yeah, because that's one of those weird things. Because, like, I mean, granted, I mean, they were very similar characters, so it could be assumed that Chara, you know, if that actually is their canonical name, which, you know, given that you named them at the beginning of the game, is not really likely. But, I mean, there is the very real fact that in this world, Chris was the Chara analog, so there is no true Chara in this universe.
Which might not be the case. Chara may not exist, or they might be dead, or they might literally be Chris. Furthermore, there are two versions of Chara that we need to discuss. The original human version of Chara and the undead abomination version of Chara that is created at the end of the genocide route.
Yeah.
These two versions of the character are different enough to warrant separate discussions, much like Azrael and Flowey. So first, I will discuss how likely it is that the original human version of Chara could end up being the Roaring Knight. Starting with means, the original version of Chara in the Undertale timeline matches several of the elements that define the physical appearance of the knight. Chara had 5 fingers, wielded a knife, and as a human, almost certainly wielded a respectable quantity of determination, and thus could likely create dark fountains. Furthermore, if they're anything like Chris, then they would likely automatically acquire armor upon entering the Dark World. Chara was, admittedly, a small child, so their arms are rather short, but if this is an older version of Chara we are dealing with, then their arms could have easily grown longer.
You say that, and then we're gonna see, like, oh, adult Chara, and it's basically like Chris's height, but they have this little arms coming off the side of their torso. Oh, that'd be horrible. Oh god, in this universe, Chara is a thalidomide baby. Oh god.
In terms of motive, Chara was both unhappy and unhinged. They climbed Mount Ebott potentially to commit suicide as a direct result of their hatred for humanity. After falling into the underground, they decided to devote themselves to saving the monsters and literally poisoned themselves in order to fuse with Azrael and get the opportunity to kill some of the humans that they hated. You could argue that Chara had good intentions in this story. It's admittedly a matter of interpretation, but this tells us is that Chara is a dangerous and intense person who is willing to pursue radical and deadly strategies in order to bring about their desired goals. As such, if Chara thought the Roaring or the Angel's Heaven was something worth pursuing, they would be more than willing to become the Roaring Knight. Obviously, they would have to have a different story in Deltarune, but assuming their core personality is the same, then they've clearly got the aptitude to bring about the Roaring. Honestly, having Chara be the main antagonist would definitely be an interesting turn of events. In terms of opportunity, this is where this option gets extremely dubious. Chris is, as far as we know, the only human in the hometown. As such, if a new human, presumably an adult human, came to town, that would be extremely notable, and tons of people would be talking about it. As such, in order for this to work, Chara would have to completely conceal their presence in the hometown, and while that's not impossible, it has much less evidence supporting it than most of the other options. Furthermore, if this game takes place around the same era as Undertale, then Chara could be long dead, which would make this option much harder to swing. That said, we don't know for certain whose red soul this is during the opening intro sequence. As such, if this is actually Chara's soul, and Gaster did something with it, like put it in a new, younger vessel, then it could be that Chara is alive and well, and has become the Roaring Knight. But again, this is assuming that Chris isn't the Deltarune version of Chara, which we don't actually know to be the case.
Yeah, actually thinking about that, going off that whole idea that Chara's soul was put into a new younger body, I guess that is kind of a weird extension of my own theory, talking about how like the idea that Chris themselves is like an escaped Goner Maker body that was like imperfect and somehow had a will of their own and escaped, and that's how we gain control over them.
As far as human Chara is concerned, they are definitely a strong contender, as they have determination in spades, 5 fingers, they should have longer arms, they're known to wield a knife, and if they're similar to Chris, then they likely acquired a suit of armor upon entering the Dark World. They also have the perfect attitude and disposition to want to bring about the roaring. And while it's a somewhat hard sell to believe they're sneaking around undetected in the hometown, the fact that they may be the character featured in this intro sequence with Gaster definitely lends itself to Chara being the twist villain of this story.
Surprise!
Such,
another human!
I would say human Chara is the first A-tier option on this list.
Thinking about it, that could also do something. Like, I'd imagine that would really mess with Chris. Because as far as we know, Chris has never met another human before. They've been around monsters literally their entire life. To the point that, they want to be a monster, going back to the whole fake horns thing. So the idea that, they meet another human and they end up being the knight trying to end the world.
There are some holes in this theory, so it's not guaranteed, but they are an important enough character for this to be a highly compelling option. Next, we have to talk about the resurrected nightmare version of Chara, who I will just call the Demon. To be clear, the Demon is not Chara, in the same way that Flowey is not Azrael. The Demon is a soulless abomination, while Chara was a human with at least some good in them. In terms of means, the Demon has many of the same attributes that made Chara a viable option. They have 5 fingers, they wield a knife, they have the determination of the soul that they purchased from the player, and there's a good chance that they would be outfitted with armor upon entering the Dark World. The only attribute that the Demon lacks is the long arms. However, as an unnatural abomination, it's quite possible that this creature could extend its arms or possess someone who actually has long arms, so there's definitely ways to work around this shortcoming.
You say that, and then it's going to turn out that Demon Chara is the opposite of human Chara, where they're not a thalidomide baby, and for them, Demon Chara's arms are just like 10 feet long, so it's like, oh wait, actually, no. Have you ever seen the Gluckins from Oddworld? To the fact that their lower body is so emaciated and withered that the reason they look so stupid is because they walk around on their hands. That would be so stupid, I'd love it.
In terms of motive, this is where things get complicated. According to the Demon itself, it exists purely to acquire power. That is its purpose. It exists to destroy its enemies and increase its stats. That is all it cares about. It cannot understand why the player insists on recreating the Undertale world, but it also doesn't care. It will come whenever and wherever its name is called, destroy the enemy, and gain power. So while it is definitely unethical enough to bring about the end of the world, the issue is with the choice to become the Roaring Knight. Why would an entity free of any desire except the urge to destroy bother with such an elaborate ruse? Maybe it wants to lure out the angel in order to kill a truly powerful foe, but still, that demonstrates a level of complexity that the Demon, by its own admittance, does not seem to possess.
I mean, alternatively, it could also just be that, it's working with a limited amount of power at the moment, so it's trying to work within its limits. I mean, we have no idea how strong it is or how much of its power may have transferred over from Undertale or what other universe it came from, so...
Maybe it could grow and evolve over time, much like Flowey, but that's making some very broad assumptions that are not backed up by the evidence. Furthermore, as an entity from another world, the Demon would have to be summoned to this Deltarune reality in order to appear. So who could possibly have summoned it? Could it be Gaster? If so, why would he bother summoning an entity of pure destruction? Even he doesn't seem that insane. While I could imagine the Demon making a cameo if you pursue some sort of genocide route in Deltarune, I can't really see them bothering with all this Roaring Knight stuff. That just doesn't seem in character for an entity as simple and straightforward as the Demon. In terms of opportunity, the Demon wields enough power to completely reconstruct entire realities. So if it really has been summoned to this world, and it really is the Roaring Knight, then it wields more than enough power to teleport from place to place and create dark fountains. Although, honestly, if the demon was the Roaring Knight, then you'd think it wouldn't take so long to bring about the roaring. Couldn't an entity like the demon be capable of creating dozens of dark fountains per day? Why is it taking so long? Even if it was doing this for some end goal, I can't imagine such a laser-focused entity as the demon would waste time when it could be killing people and acquiring more power. And of course, the demon only appears if you call its name, which means it's literally impossible for it to be the Roaring Knight if nobody knows it exists, which they might not. As such, while the demon definitely has the power to bring about the roaring, the specific circumstances necessary for it to be brought here and then to be convinced that this plan is worth its time makes this option extremely convoluted and dubious. Overall, the demon has the right attributes and powers to be the Roaring Knight, and it's certainly unethical enough to bring about the end of the world, but this intricate plan to bring about the roaring seems far too complex for an entity like the demon to bother with. In the time it takes for the roaring to be brought about, the demon could have destroyed this world several times over. As such, while I know the demon being involved in this game is a fairly popular theory, I think people are kind of forgetting how utterly simplistic and direct this entity is. It's not like Flowey, and it's not like Chara. It has a one-track mind focused on a very simple goal. Kill everything and gain power. So, while definitely one of the more interesting candidates to discuss, I find the likelihood of the demon being the Roaring Knight rather low, and thus I would put it in C tier. Next up is Chilldrake. As far as means, Chilldrake is rather short, has no arms or fingers, and is thus incapable of wielding a knife. They do seem strong-willed enough to potentially create dark fountains, and while they don't exactly look like a knight, Berdly qualified as a knight in the Dark World, so maybe Chilldrake would too. In terms of motive, Chilldrake's entire personality revolves around bringing about anarchy, and thus they have the perfect mindset to want to bring about the roaring. That said, in Undertale, they cared a great deal about Snowy, and if this is still true in Deltarune, then it seems unlikely that Chilldrake would risk Snowy's life by creating a dark fountain in the school where Snowy attends. In terms of opportunity, Chilldrake hasn't even appeared in Deltarune yet, so either they don't exist, or they have very effectively avoided encountering Chris during the day. As such, whether they had the opportunity to bring about the Dark Fountains is unclear. That said, if the knight really is one of the Lighteners in the hometown, I find it unlikely that Toby Fox would conceal that Lightener for several chapters. Although, again, that's just speculation on my part.
I mean, there is that one part of town that's literally blocked off. So, who's to say that, in future chapters, we don't get to see, new parts of town that we literally didn't see in previous chapters because, Chris just decided to walk right past them without letting us interact with them at all.
Overall, Chilldrake completely fails to match the knight's appearance and may not even exist in the Deltarune reality. As such, while they do have the right mindset to bring about the roaring, their insignificance in the plot and their lack of arms, hands, or knives makes me think this option is pretty much impossible. As such, Chilldrake is the first F tier in this video.
Woo!
Next is Clover. As far as means go, Clover has rather long arms, but that's the only detail that seems to match the knight. They have paws rather than hands, they only have 3 fingers on those paws, they don't wield a knife or wear armor, and as a Darkener, they would need to have stolen a Lightener's soul or their determination in order to create dark fountains, which I find extremely unlikely for someone as flighty as Clover to have pulled off. In terms of motive, Clover literally has multiple personalities, so it's entirely possible that one of them has the correct mindset to want to bring about the roaring. They do
Yeah.
attempt to stop the Delta warriors, so they are at least helping with the king's plan to cover the world in darkness, which makes them more feasible in terms of personality than Cap'n was. In terms of opportunity, this is where things get dubious. Clover could have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, but given how they have been trapped in this empty classroom for ages, it seems unlikely that they could have stolen a Lightner's soul during that time. It makes even less sense for them to have created the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, as we meet Clover in the castle town prior to heading off to the Cyberworld, which means it's borderline impossible for them to have beat Chris and Susie to the library. Overall, Clover is another extremely unlikely option. They don't match the knight's description almost at all, and it seems borderline impossible for them to have created the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. As such, even though they might have the right motivation, I would say Clover being the knight is less believable than even Cap'n was, and thus they end up in F tier. Next up is Crystal, aka Snowdrake's mother. In terms of means, much like Chilldrake, Crystal doesn't have fingers, arms, or any noticeable connection to knives or armor or knights, and it's unknown if she possessed any notable quantity of determination. In terms of motive, Crystal is not well fleshed out, but she seems to have been a proud mother who cared for her family, and she may have also been a comedian.
Wait a second, I'm just thinking, is she alive in Deltarune? Because I just thought, and I could have sworn I remembered seeing something in the graveyard? Am I misremembering? Am I making this up? Yeah, there you go. It was Crystal, right? Yeah, that's kind of a big mark against her being the knight, given that she's quite literally dead.
However, it's rather hard to tell if she would have possessed any reason to bring about the roaring, as she's a barely comprehensible amalgamate in Undertale, and she's dead in Deltarune. Since her son goes to the school, I find it unlikely that she would risk his life by opening a dark fountain there. In terms of opportunity, Crystal is literally dead, so that's a fairly strong alibi implying that she is not the knight.
Okay, I'm just gonna call out Jaru here. And, like, this video is already 3.5 hours long. Why are you including such... Granted, I mean, like, I understand, the whole thing of going over every possible candidate, but that's the thing. Every possible candidate. The problem with, like, you're wasting precious time on options that are literally impossible, because, for A, the character is in fact dead. If for somebody like Azrael, they're out of town, or if you believe other theories, also dead. And then, like, all the time wasted on, like, trying to think on whether it's a Darkner. I mean, we've already learned that, like, Darkners turn to stone if they're outside their, their birth dark world for too long, with the exception of Rousey. So unless the knight was another Darkner like Rousey that could leave their dark world without worry of turning to stone, you also have to, like, figure out that, how does Rousey get to the other dark worlds? Is he actually leaving the dark worlds via the door and going through the light world? Or is he traveling through the dark worlds to another dark world? We're not operating with full information here.
It's possible that her soul was stolen by a Darkner, but as far as Crystal herself goes, it seems extremely unlikely that she could have faked her own death and began creating dark fountains.
Yeah.
Overall, Crystal makes even less sense to be the Roaring Knight than Chilldrake, and I'm somewhat wondering if it was even worth bringing her up in the first place.
No, it was not.
She doesn't match the Knight's appearance, doesn't have any clear motive to bring about the roaring, and she has a fairly strong alibi due to her being dead. As such, I'll be putting Crystal right at the bottom of F tier. Next is the father of Caddy and Caddy, Dad Cat. In terms of means, he presumably has paws instead of hands and is never seen with weapons or armor of any sort. That said, he is an adult, so his arm is somewhat long, and the fact that he has lost one of his arms could imply that Dad Cat was a soldier at some point, which means he could have some experience with weapons and he might have above average determination. He is also a large man, so much like Asgore, this line mentioning a large person could be hinting at the size of the knight. He also probably has 4 fingers, which is the minimum necessary to match the knight. In terms of motive, we don't know much about Dadcat, and considering he had to get his stomach pumped for oranges, he's scared of pickles, and the fact that he doesn't know Azrael's real name, it seems like he might be about as stupid as his eldest daughter.
God, I honestly don't remember that from Deltarune. Man, it's been a long time since I played chapters 1 and 2. I completely forgot that he had to get his stomach pumped with oranges. And I don't think I read that part about him not remembering Azrael's actual name. How's your brother Doug gonna come by? Oh, God.
Which makes it somewhat hard to believe that he could bring about the roaring. He also seems like a fairly happy man, so it seems unlikely that he'd want to shake up the status quo. Plus, his daughter goes to the school, so you'd think Dadcat wouldn't want to put his daughter at risk by making a dark fountain there.
Well, then again, you did say he was stupid, and if he's not stupid, he could just be malicious. You never know.
And in terms of opportunity, his daughter goes to the school, so it's conceivable that he could have snuck in and created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, and it is theoretically possible that he could have gone to the library, although we have no evidence supporting that. Overall, Dadcat might have a secret or two, especially with his missing arm, but he has no clear motivation for bringing about the roaring, and while he might have had the opportunity to make these dark fountains, it seems against his character to put his daughter at risk by making them. That said, he does have enough mystery around him to make slightly more sense than Caddy, so I'll put him in C tier. Side note, I won't be ranking Mom Cat, as there's even less to discuss with her than Dad Cat. Honestly, I only included him because he's missing an arm, and that caught my attention.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Next up is Des Holiday. In terms of means, we...
Des Holiday, and aka... the anti-Noel.
We don't know how long Des's arms are, and we don't actually know how many fingers the Holiday family possess, but they definitely seem to have fingers and decently long arms. Des doesn't seem to have any known connection to knights or armor or knives, but she did attack Chris with a wiffle bat at one point, so she has wielded a weapon before. She's also a lightener, and she sounds like she's stronger-willed than Noel, so it seems feasible that she could create dark fountains. In terms of motive, this is where things get extremely speculative. We don't know much about Des's personality beyond her being protective of Noel, so that's all we really have to go off of. That said, her and Noel made a doll of the angel in their youth group at church, so it may be that Des was on the religious side. As such, It could be that she wants to bring about the angel's heaven in order to make a better world for her sister, and that's why she became the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, the implication seems to be that Des is either dead or missing, which either increases her chances of being the knight or decreases it, depending on which interpretation is correct. If she's dead, then it would be rather difficult for her to be the Roaring Knight.
Yeah,
however,
as
she
said
has no
before.
gravestone in the graveyard, so it stands to reason that she's probably just missing. Maybe she ran away from home or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Des having an unhappy home life could definitely be a reason for her wanting to bring about the roaring. Alternatively, if she was abducted or something similar, then that means there's likely a greater mystery to be uncovered regarding Des, which could be evidence that she has become the Roaring Knight against her will. If she is the knight, she would need to conceal her identity when sneaking into the library
helmet and
or
all
into
that.
the school. So that part is somewhat dubious. But Des, being the knight, would explain why the queen was so fixated on Noel. If the queen saw the knight and they looked like an older sibling of Noel's, then it would make perfect sense for the queen to try and create a new knight using another member of the Holiday family. Overall, Des is such a mysterious character that it's hard to discuss her role in this game. That said, she seems to match a couple of the knight's attributes. There's a major mystery surrounding her that could tie into her being the knight, and she may have just the right combination of trauma, personality traits, and determination to bring about the roaring. She definitely seems to play some major role in this story, so why couldn't that role be that of the main antagonist? That said, her lack of connection to knights and armor and weapons definitely hurts this option, and the fact that she might simply be dead also hurts her candidacy.
Yeah.
As such, I'm going to go ahead and put Des in B tier. I think she's one of the more compelling candidates, but there's just too much mystery surrounding her for me to feel confident putting her in A tier. Next is Dogami, Doggeressa, Doggo, Lesser Dog, and Greater Dog, also known as the Wet-Nosed Bandits, who I will be analyzing together. In terms of means, they have paws instead of hands, but they all have decently long arms, 4 fingers on each paw, and in the Undertale timeline, they were members of the Royal Guard and wielded weapons, including knives,
but now they're
and several
criminals.
of them wore the armor of a knight. There's quite a few of them, so it stands to reason that some of them are strong-willed enough to create dark fountains. Several of them are also fairly large, and thus could be the ones being referenced by this large person line. In terms of motive, the dogs are all criminals in this timeline, and there's at least one ending in Undertale where the dogs take over. So maybe they have the ambition to want to shake up the status quo by becoming the Roaring Knight. That said, all the dogs aren't exactly super intelligent, so it's a bit dubious that they have the competency to pull this off. They were all scared away from sneaking into Noelle's house by some unknown attacker, so I doubt they have the strength of will to bring about the apocalypse if they can't even handle a simple burglary.
That again, oh no, that just points towards the weird the icy and the night being the same thing. Oh god, oh no.
In terms of opportunity, this is where this option really falls apart. A gang of criminals
they were literally in
sneaking into
jail.
a school is already an extremely dubious prospect. But more importantly, the dogs were all locked up in jail, in the doghouse, if you will, with the implication seeming to be that they've been there for some time, which means it's extremely unlikely that they could have been in the right place at the right time to create any of the dark fountains. Overall, the dogs match some of the knight's description, but not enough to be convincing. And while they may have the right attitude for it, their lack of intelligence makes the idea of any of them successfully becoming the Roaring Knight a comical concept. Throw in the fact that they've been in jail for months, and I think it's safe to say that none of these characters could be the Roaring Knight. I put the dogs in D tier. I was going to talk about Endogeny next, but it occurs to me that this character doesn't even exist in Deltarune.
Yeah, and they're dead.
The grave of Mutler, the former leader of the dogs, who was likely one of the monsters who made up Endogeny. However, Mutler would have all the issues that the other dogs have, on top of the fact that he is dead. As such, I'll just save us some time and put Endogeny/Mutler in F tier, as it's literally impossible for this entity to be the Roaring Knight. Next up is a much stranger candidate, Everyman. Everyman is a strange, recurring character that has never appeared in person, but who makes cameos in several places within both Undertale and Deltarune. In terms of means, Everyman has somewhat long arms, but he has no hands, fingers, armor, weapons, and he has nothing to do with knights. He may have some notable amount of determination, but he also might not. It's impossible to say. He might not even be a real person in the Deltarune reality and may instead be a fictional character of some sort.
Yeah, again, this is my one complaint with this video. Like, seemingly Jaru is wasting so much time on characters where it's literally, well, not literally, it's physically impossible for them to be it. And again, like Everyman, again, you don't even going back to Undertale, you don't even fight Everyman. Everyman appears in an attack. And, you know, a couple of other places, but we've never actually met Everyman as a character.
In terms of motive, this is where things get borderline impossible to discuss. The only description we have of Everyman comes from the Undertale art book, in which Toby Fox describes him as a good guy who shows up on occasion. The showing up on occasion part could be a decent description of the knight, but it's debatable if the knight really qualifies as a good guy. That said, given Toby Fox's writing style, I'm sure that whoever the knight turns out to be, they'll think of themselves as the good guy, so maybe this description could describe the knight.
I mean,
But
every hero
honestly,
does
this category.
Every well-written, villain thinks of themselves as, the hero of their own story.
Is a dud. We really have no clue what motivates Everyman, or even if he's a real person. In terms of opportunity, this is also completely speculative. Given his ability to randomly appear in unexpected places, it's not impossible to imagine him showing up in the school or the library in order to create the Dark Fountains. That said, if he's a famous enough character to have people making graffiti of him, you'd think there'd be more discussion in the hometown from the people who saw the iconic Everyman walking around. Overall, Everyman is one of the most pervasive mysteries in this franchise. Mm-hmm. He could just be a meaningless inside joke that Toby Fox likes to slip into his games. Or he may be of profound importance to the plot. We really don't know. That said, I have extreme doubts that Toby Fox would make this random, bizarre entity, who was introduced as an attack by an amalgamate in Undertale,
quite literally,
the Roaring Knight in Deltarune.
Then why did you bring him up?
He doesn't match the knight's description regardless, so I think I'll just throw Everyman down in D tier and move on with the list.
D?
Next is one of the more popular and interesting candidates, Father Alvin. In terms of means, Alvin has relatively long arms, his father was a blacksmith and thus he might have access to weapons and armor, and he seems like the kind of man who might have a decent quantity of determination. Even if Alvin doesn't have access to armor, the fact that he's a turtle could cause him to naturally acquire armor upon entering the Dark World.
Yeah,
unfortunately, you can't quite make out how many fingers he has, but Gerson seemed to have 4 fingers in Undertale, which could very well be how many the knight has. As such, Father Alvin matches the knight's description to a T. In terms of motive, this is where Father Alvin has a very strong argument. He is a priest who worships the angel, and thus he would have substantial religious motivation to bring about the angel's heaven. In fact, his theological studies may have been responsible for him discovering the existence of the Dark World in the first place. Given the death of his father and this suspicious dialogue we get in Chapter 2, it definitely seems like Father Alvin has some secrets he's hiding, which could contribute to his motivation to bring about the Roaring as the knight. And as an interesting side note, in medieval societies, knights were often born into nobility, and thus were often the sons of lords. And Gerson has written a book series called Lord of the Hammer. As such, you could argue that Father Alvin is the son of a lord and is thus eligible to be a knight.
I mean, I guess that could work. Again, I can't help but keep thinking back to, what was it, Cammy Boy G's thing where, Gerson used the Dark Worlds to write his stories, then Alvin discovered it, possibly tried to use it to, bring his father back from the dead, failed, and that's when he ran away from, the closet and stuff like that.
In terms of opportunity, this option actually has quite a bit of interesting evidence. In the empty classroom where the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain was created, there is a drawing of Gerson on the wall, which has been confirmed to be a drawing that Father Alvin created. As such, this shows not only that Father Alvin attended this school, but also that he specifically knows about this particular classroom. As such, he may have chosen to create a dark fountain in this classroom specifically because he knows it was unused and abandoned. He likely doesn't want to hurt the kids, but if he knew that the classroom was abandoned, then he'd have no reason to worry about any children falling in. As for the cyberworld, this option is a little more dubious, as we never see Alvin anywhere near the library, but he is a priest after all, so it stands to reason that he would visit a place filled with books in order to further his theological studies.
Yeah,
Although why he would create a dark fountain when there were children inside the computer lab is a hard question to answer.
Maybe he's starting to go a little nuts where it's like, prepare to meet your god, Dark World, and then runs away.
Maybe he doesn't care as much about the safety of children as you'd expect, or maybe he thinks they'll be a necessary sacrifice for bringing about the angel's heaven. Or maybe he thinks the angel could revive them even if they did die. It's hard to say. Regardless, there's no evidence that Father Alvin has been to the library, but there's no evidence that he hasn't been either. Overall, Father Alvin is a very valid candidate, and the fact that he's a brand new character further increases the believability that he may secretly be the knight. He has the perfect motivation, plenty of opportunities to create fountains, and the right background to have conceivably discovered the existence of said fountains. Even his history with his father being a smith gives credence to the idea of him having access to armor and weapons. The Dark World has the Deltarune all over it, and Alvin literally wears the Deltarune on his robes. So the idea that he may be involved in this plot seems extremely believable. He also matches every single detail about the knight that we currently possess, which makes him an increasingly more compelling option. That said, there are one or two tiny details that could push against Alvin being the knight.
What would those
be?
For
one, Father Alvin does not have a dialogue portrait that we see in conversation, which is something most other main characters have. Even Jocking Ton has a dialogue portrait. Furthermore, Father Alvin has no dialogue sound clip that you hear when talking to him. Most other characters have a distinct audio clip that represents their voice when they're talking, including characters like Noel and Birdley, and yet Father Alvin does not. When he talks, it uses the same generic audio clip that all the minor NPCs are given. Of course, this could be Toby Fox just pulling a sly one and pretending Father Alvin is not important.
Though, okay, now I'm thinking about that. How much you want to bet that when Chapter 3 and 4 come out, the demo in like Chapters 1 and 2 are updated and he is in fact given a portrait? Oh god, that would blow everybody's mind, wouldn't it? Oh no.
And of course, even with those minor issues, he still has hordes of evidence in his favor. As such, since Father Alvin is easily one of the strongest contenders for being the knight, I will happily put him in A tier. Next up is the final boss of most Undertale timelines, Flowey. In terms of means, Flowey is a flower and is thus incapable of wielding knives or armor, and he literally does not have arms or hands. His Omega form could create hands for him to use, but that form only existed for a brief period of time and is officially defeated in all Undertale timelines.
And, I mean, granted, I'm going to call it out here that, Jaru's going to kind of point it out, but for Flowey to exist, that requires both Azrael to be dead, and for the determination experiments to have been conducted on the specific flower that had, Azrael's dust and stuff on it. So, yeah, from everything I've seen, unless Flowey was some sort of, experiment gone wrong from, Gaster in his bunker in the south of town, I don't see him even existing in this game. Unless there's some weird Delta Traveler nonsense going on here.
So I highly doubt it could appear in Deltarune. The only attribute that Flowey meets the requirements of is the fact that he did, in fact, wield a great deal of determination, and while it doesn't make sense for Flowey to be mistaken as a knight, it would explain why the Spade King respects him. Flowey would happily put a lunatic like the Spade King into power, and since Flowey isn't actually a lightener, the king would have no reason to hate him. Next is motive. Honestly, given Flowey's track record, I would not put it past him to pursue the Roaring just to see what would happen. He'd even create dark fountains in schools and risk the lives of children, as he is a sociopath with no respect for the sanctity of life. He may be doing this to gain power, he may be doing this to accomplish some other goal, but it's definitely conceivable that Flowey would walk this path. Plus, hey, Flowey was the primary antagonist in Undertale, so why not have him be the primary antagonist in Deltarune too? Next is opportunity, and that's where this option completely falls apart. Flowey shouldn't exist in the Deltarune reality, which means that in order for him to be the knight, he would have to find some way to travel from the Undertale timeline to the Deltarune one.
Oh god, no. Oh, actually, maybe yes, but that's just it. Toby Fox is making Delta Traveler canon. Yes, yes.
And as far as we know, that is not possible. Sure, Sans was at one point able to hop between worlds, but that required a machine that is now broken. So without that machine, I can't see Flowey managing to hop from one reality to another. If he did manage to get to Deltarune, then him sneaking into the school or library would be child's play given his ability to burrow underground, but without the ability to somehow travel between worlds, this option seems impossible.
Yeah.
Overall, Flowey has the perfect motive and personality to be the Roaring Knight, but he lacks most of the attributes that define the Knight, and it's borderline impossible for Flowey to reach the Deltarune reality in the first place. It could conceivably be possible for Flowey to accidentally get recreated in this timeline, but the circumstances that created Flowey are so specific and are so improbable to occur again that I don't think Flowey himself could ever actually appear in Deltarune.
Yeah, unless there was some really weird cosmic shenanigans going on where this Flowey, if this Flowey actually existed, was made out of somebody else other than Azrael. Which, I mean, even then, could you even classify them as actually being Flowey at that point?
Maybe someone similar to Flowey could appear, but not Flowey himself. As such, I think I'll have to put Flowey in F tier, as it seems legitimately impossible for him to be the Roaring Knight. Next up is an option that is rather interesting to consider: Frisk. We covered the antagonist of Undertale, and now we're covering the protagonist. Funny how that works out. In terms of means, Frisk meets every requirement. They have 5 fingers, can wield a knife, would likely manifest armor if they entered the Dark World.
Again, that's all assuming that Frisk literally isn't just Chris in this instance.
Just like Chris, and they have more natural determination than any other character in this franchise. Their arms are rather short, but if we're dealing with an older version of Frisk, then they would match the Knight's appearance perfectly. In terms of motive, this is where things get sketchy. It's hard exactly to tell what kind of person Frisk is, as they're being controlled by the player for the majority of Undertale. However, if you've seen my video on Who is Chris, then you'll know that I personally believe the evidence shows that Frisk is a good kid who just wants to avoid conflict and make friends. As such, it doesn't really make sense for Frisk to do things like create dark fountains and risk bringing about the end of the world. They're far too good of a person for something like that. It would take some very convoluted reasoning for Frisk to walk the path of the Roaring Knight. So in terms of motive, I think this option falls flat.
Yeah.
In terms of opportunity, this is where things get complicated. Much like Flowey, I don't think it's possible for the Undertale version of Frisk to wind up in this reality.
So it would be a different version of Frisk.
Unlike Flowey, there should be a Deltarune version of Frisk somewhere in this world. In fact, Chris might literally be the Deltarune version of Frisk. However, if Frisk is not Chris, then that raises many of the same issues that Chara raised. Chris is the only known human in town, so some new human showing up and sneaking around would almost certainly raise suspicion and have people talking about it. Furthermore, if Deltarune takes place earlier on in the timeline, then Frisk may not have even been born yet. It's not impossible for Frisk to be sneaking about creating fountains, but it is highly unlikely.
Yeah.
Overall, Frisk matches the Knight in terms of most attributes, but they are far too kind to walk a path so reckless and harmful, and they also probably don't even exist in this reality at this point in time unless they are literally Chris. As such, while technically an option, I find Frisk being the Roaring Knight to make too little sense to be feasible, and thus I'd put Frisk in C tier.
Yeah.
While I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and put the other human souls in C tier as well. They have most of the same problems and advantages as Frisk, but are much less significant characters. I will give a special shout
they're
out
also
to the
all dead
soul, as their characteristics match the Knight slightly more than the rest. But overall, I think these characters are too minor to really factor into this discussion. Even if one of them is the Knight, we know far too little about them to discuss this option any further.
No, that's it. It was Clover all along. Clover's the Knight!
Next is one of my favorite characters, Gerson Boom. In terms of means, as we said with Father Alvin,
he is dead, so move on!
Gerson was a smith who likely had access to armor and weapons. In Undertale, he was a legendary hero, so him being a knight would definitely be in character. He also has fairly long arms, natural armor in the form of his shell, the required number of fingers to potentially match the knight, and as the toughest monster to ever live, he definitely seems like the sort to have above average determination. The only detail he fails to match is the fact that his chosen weapon was a hammer and not a knife. In terms of motive, Gerson was the father of Father Alvin, who went on to be a priest of the Angel. As such, it's quite possible that Gerson is also the religious type. But even without that religious angle, he's a historian who is well-read, and thus he could have done the research necessary to have discovered the existence of dark fountains. Heck, in Undertale, he is literally studying the Deltarune, and is the only character to ever bring it up, so you'd expect him to play some larger role in Deltarune the game. He was also a fairly morally gray character, as even though he was lauded as a great hero, he never saw himself as one. He just did what he had to in order to protect his people. As such, with that degree of moral nuance, it is possible that Gerson might be convinced to pursue the Roaring. However, that's where this logic seems to have issues. The Roaring is supposed to bring devastation, and Gerson is specifically known for being a teacher who cared for his kids, so him choosing to create dark fountains in the school and the library seems out of character for Gerson. Similarly, given how fond he was of Asgore in Undertale, I find it extremely unlikely that Gerson would feel comfortable putting a despot like the Spade King into power. In terms of opportunity, Gerson is apparently dead, which is a pretty strong alibi in favor of him not being the knight. That said, if he was somehow alive, him being a former teacher and a historian would suggest that he had likely visited both the unused classroom that later became the Card Kingdom and the library that later would house the Cyberworld. That said, the whole being dead hurdle is pretty massive, and Gerson was already a super old man, so him being the main antagonist feels dubious. It would feel strange for us to beat up some old turtle if he turned out to be the knight.
Again, it's just all this time wasted on characters who are literally dead. Like, what? Why?
That said, I do think it's interesting that Gerson was known as the Hammer of Justice in Undertale, and the Spade King has a line where he says he wields the Chain of Justice. This is reminiscent of Undyne, who was also inspired by Gerson, who wields the Spear of Justice. Furthermore, Gerson wrote a book series called Lord of the Hammer, and in medieval societies, while lords tended to employ knights, lords would also fight in battle alongside their knights, and thus Gerson, as Lord of the Hammer, could have some inherent ties to knighthood. This could all be coincidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. Overall, Gerson matches every known attribute of the knight, arguably has a somewhat decent motivation to bring about the Roaring, has the right background to have discovered the existence of the Dark Fountains, and could definitely have known about the empty classroom and computer lab due to his time as a teacher and historian.
But he's
However,
dead.
His care for his children and students, his extreme age, and the fact that he is supposedly dead all come together to make this option problematic. Gerson, being the knight, has enough issues that I can't put him in A tier, but I feel like he has enough connections to knighthood, enough similarities with the knight, and enough background with the Deltarune that he's better than most of the C tiers. As such, I'll put him in B tier.
Okay.
Next is the Mad Jester Jevil. In terms of means, Jevil doesn't match almost any of the knight's traits.
Again, and he's a darkener,
and thus has shorter arms. He's a jester and not a knight. He doesn't wear armor. His sprite does not reveal how many fingers he has, and he wields a scythe instead of a knife. That said, he does seem more powerful than the other Darkeners, which could imply that he has determination. And while he doesn't wield a knife, his weapon does have the word knife in its name. Furthermore, his weapon is literally called the Devil's Knife, and since the knight has been connected to hell, Jevil transforming into a weapon with the word devil in it could be hinting he's the knight. In terms of motive, Jevil has been driven mad and views the whole world as a game, and thus he is more than capable of bringing about the roaring if he thought it would be fun. Since having fun is his only real motivation, and since he's so knowledgeable about the knight, it could be argued that he has this knowledge as a direct result of being the knight.
God, again, I don't see it as possible because, again, he's a darkener. And I don't see it possible for the knight to be a darkener. But can you imagine if, the actual knight's reasoning for everything was essentially boiling down to he was the Joker. He's essentially like Deltarune's version of the Joker. He's just nuts.
And he's just doing all the roaring stuff for fun. That said, if he really is the knight, then it wouldn't really make sense for him to give the Delta Warriors his armor/weapon to help them in their quest, as they are actively fighting against his plans.
Yeah.
Then again, he is insane, so maybe he's easily distracted from his goals. In terms of opportunity, this is where this option goes straight into the trash can. Jevil has been imprisoned for quite some time, and since it was the Four Kings who imprisoned Jevil, that means Jevil was locked up long before the knight came to town.
And also, Spade King would have known and recognized him as well. Hey, aren't you that, crazy jester that I used to hire?
Furthermore, if the Delta Warriors don't fight him in Chapter 1, he stays imprisoned, which would make him creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain borderline impossible. Furthermore, when he is defeated, he talks about the knight, and it doesn't really make sense to do that if he is the knight. Maybe he's trying to confuse the heroes, but it doesn't really make sense for the first secret boss in Deltarune to also be the primary antagonist. Also, Jevil says he's going to sleep for the next 100 years, and he turned himself into his weapon and gives himself to the heroes to use. If he's asleep and literally in our inventory, then it seems impossible for him to be sneaking off and creating dark fountains. As it stands, unless there's some crazy plot twists, Jevil is one of the only characters whose whereabouts are constantly verified. He was imprisoned before the Delta Warriors arrived, and he was asleep in their inventory for the rest of the time. As such, as far as opportunity goes, Jevil seems incapable of being in the right places at the right times to be the Roaring Knight. Overall, while Jevil's personality could certainly allow him to pursue the roaring, Jevil fails to match most of the knight's attributes, on top of it being seemingly impossible for him to have created any of the dark fountains we've seen thus far. In order to be the knight, he would have to have secretly acquired a lightner's determination, have secretly broke out of prison, have disguised himself as the knight without ever being recognized by any of the Card Kingdom Darkners, have snuck back into his prison to fight us, to have snuck out of our inventory to go create the cyberworld, and then snuck back into our inventory without us ever noticing. I'm not saying that Jevil being the knight is completely and utterly impossible, but it certainly feels completely and utterly impossible.
Yeah.
As such, Jevil goes right down into F tier.
Yes!
Next up is the kindest, coolest, and all-around greatest person in Deltarune. You know him, you love him, Jocking Ton. In terms of means, Jocking Ton, as a cool green snake, has no arms or legs or fingers and is thus incapable of wielding a weapon or armor or matching any of the details that define the knight's appearance. The only detail he has in his favor is the fact that he, as Jocking Ton, likely has a great deal of determination. In terms of motive, Jocking Ton is far too kind and honest and, simple-minded to ever want to bring about the roaring. It's possible that he could be tricked into pursuing that course. Maybe he learned about the roaring from Caddy, but as far as his baseline personality is concerned, I cannot imagine that Jocking Ton would risk the lives of his classmates by creating dark worlds in the library or school.
Yeah, I love how this one basically breaks down. Oh, Jocking Ton can't be the knight because A, he's a snake, B, he's stupid.
It just seems too out of character for the great Jockington. In terms of
Definitely.
opportunity, Jockington is a student at the school and is also known to use the library, so he'd have plenty of opportunities to create the Dark Worlds. That said, he is found at the diner with Caddy at the end of Chapter 2, so if he was in the diner the whole day, it's possible that he has an alibi that keeps him from being the knight. Overall, Jockington is far too cool to be the Roaring Knight. He doesn't match the knight's description, he doesn't have the right motive or personality to pursue the Roaring, and while he could have created the Dark Fountains, it is highly probable that he did no such thing.
Yeah, people who want to be Roaring Knights are lame.
As such, I will put Jockington in the tier that is reserved for only the coolest of characters. Next is the first big antagonist in Deltarune, the King, also known as the Spade King. In terms of means, the King is a fairly large man who wields various strange weapons.
But again, he's a Darkener. And in the Light World, he would be a playing card. It wouldn't work! On top of, the whole thing of, he saw the Knight, and people can confirm that they were two different people. And that is it for now, unfortunately. This is, of course, a part of a much larger reaction, so link to the next part should be appearing, somewhere over my face, as well as in the corner of the video. I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you in the next part. See ya!